all praises to the heavenly, holy, almighty creator of eternity and infinity, the universe, and all there is. This is Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit. Hello, family. We are back together again, and we are converging on the Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit den, where we will be continuing our review on the United Nations General Assembly report of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent in its mission to the United States of America. And family, this is a UN report that was composed by a working group as an extension for a case for reparations for the American descendants of the enslaved. And despite the political culture, which is including or has included our former presidents and current political candidates, the growing voice, the growing campaign for the righteous retribution, recompense, and restoration of the descendants of those enslaved here in the American continental boundary will continue to grow and become a mainstay on the mainstream conversation. And so, despite some of those politicians who display a clear ignorance as to what reparations are, or want to compose committees to study the idea of reparation, and those who just outright oppose the idea of getting it right, doing the right thing, fixing the spirit of the nation. Well, despite all the brouhaha and the deflections and the distractions and the straight out denials, a report has already been formulated which outlines the condition, the disenfranchisement, the discrimination, the destitution of the American descendants of slaves on the American shores. And so, family, we will be continuing today with a review of said report, Report A/HRC/33/61/Addendum 2. And in this part of the presentation, we will be examining the manifestations of racial discrimination. And so, family, become comfortable. Let us be still. Let us be quiet. Let us absorb the information for the healing and the understanding of the nation. And we begin. Manifestations of racial discrimination, the criminal justice system, and the barriers to civil and political participation. The working group is deeply concerned at the alarming levels of police brutality and excessive use of lethal force by law enforcement officials committed with impunity against people of African descent in the United States. In addition to the most recent and well-known cases of killings of unarmed African Americans, such as the cases of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, and Laquan McDonald. The working group received information about many other similar cases. The working group met with a considerable number of relatives of African Americans allegedly killed by police officers that are still seeking justice for their loved ones, including Tyrone West, Tyron Lewis, Jonathan Sanders, Oscar Grant, Tony Robinson, Marlon Brown, India Kager, Ronald Johnson, Muhammad Ba, Rakia Boyd, Sandra Bland, and Alonzo Smith. Despite efforts made by the Department of Justice, there is still a lack of an official national system to track killings committed by law enforcement officials. Federal authorities commented that the main reason for this problem is that 18,000 police departments and law enforcement agencies in the United States are not obliged to report these types of incidents. The Department of Justice was aware of the information gap and informed the working group that notwithstanding the need for legislation, it was also building a system to track information nationwide. To date, the system had not been launched. In the absence of a public national system to track cases of killings by police officers, the Guardian's newspapers, the Counted database identified a total of 1,136 people killed by police in 2015, of whom 302 were African American. African Americans were killed at twice the rate of whites, Hispanics, and Native Americans. In addition, about 25% of the African Americans killed were unarmed, compared to 17% of white people. The Washington Post database of police shootings registered 990 people shot dead in 2015, of whom 38 were unarmed African Americans. Excessive and disproportionate use of force against African Americans also includes the use of tasers and heavy-handed assaults by law enforcement officials, which also have been debilitating with its consequences for victims. There is no national system to track such incidents either. The working group is deeply concerned about the low number of cases where police officers have been held accountable for these crimes despite the evidence. The Guardian reported that only 18 law enforcement officers were charged with crimes in relation to the 1,136 killings registered in 2015. 1 in every 4 killings by police officers that occurred in the first quarter of 2015 remain unresolved more than a year later, and 69% of the 289 cases of killings by the police in the first 3 months of 2015 have been ruled justified or accidental. The final report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing acknowledged some of the obstacles in tackling impunity related to killings by police officers and recommended mandatory external and independent criminal investigations and the use of external and independent prosecutors in cases of police use of force resulting in injury or death. Killings of unarmed African Americans by the police is only the tip of the iceberg in what is a pervasive racial bias in the judicial justice system. The working group heard testimonies of African Americans that face a pattern of police practices which violate their human rights, that are disproportionately targeted for police surveillance, and experience and witness public harassment, excessive force, and racial discrimination. Due to racial bias, there is fear of approaching the police for help, and there's also a failure on the part of the state to provide protection. The working group heard testimonies from African Americans based on their experience that from an early age they are treated by the state as a dangerous criminal group and face a presumption of guilt rather than of innocence. The rapid negative escalation of situations and excessive use of force disproportionately used on African Americans demonstrates this concern. The working group heard reports of racial profiling, and that racial profiling is a rampant practice among law enforcement officials. During the country visit, the working group was informed about and observed the excessive control and supervision targeting all levels of the lives of African Americans. This control has been reinforced since September 2001 by the introduction of the Patriot Act, and affects not only United States citizens, but also has a disparate impact on the detention, treatment, and deportation of undocumented migrants, including people of African descent who enter the United States. The report by the Department of Justice on the Ferguson Police Department, released on March 4, 2015, confirmed that these practices are used On the basis of police data on stops, searches, and arrests, the report documented that although African Americans constitute 67% of the population in Ferguson, 85% of the traffic stops, 90% of tickets, and 93% of arrests made by the Ferguson police in 2012 through 2014 were against African Americans. One of the main conclusions of the report was that Ferguson law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than the public safety needs. This emphasis on revenue has compromised the institutional character of Ferguson's police department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing. Further, Ferguson's police and municipal court practices both reflect and exacerbate existing racial bias, including racial stereotypes. Ferguson's own data established clear racial disparities and adversely impacts African Americans. The evidence shows that discriminatory intent is part of the reason for these disparities. Similarly, a report released in April 2016 by the Police Accountability Task Force in Chicago concluded that racism was one of the main factors that could explain the pattern of arrests without justification, detentions without legal counsel, and physical and verbal abuse, including deaths and injuries against African Americans committed by members of Chicago Police Department. The report shows that despite African Americans constituting only 1/3 of the city's population, 74% of the 404 people shot by the Chicago police between 2008 and 2015 were Black. 3 out of every 4 people on whom the Chicago police officers used tasers between 2012 and 2015 were African Americans, and 72% of the investigative street stops that did not lead to arrest in the summer of 2014 were carried out on African Americans. The report emphasizes that the Chicago Police Department's own data give validity to a widely held belief that the police have no regard for the sanctity of life when it comes to people of color. The working group recognizes steps taken at the federal and state level to end racial profiling. In 2014, the city of New York withdrew an appeal in connection with the landmark Floyd versus City of New York case and agreed to join a remedial process ordered by a federal judge who had found the city liable for a decade-long pattern of discriminatory and unconstitutional stop and frisk practices that disproportionately affected the Black and Latino communities. In a recent report by the Independent Monitor of the remedial process, it was understood that despite the recent reductions in the absolute number of stops recorded by the New York Police Department and the adoption of a set of preventive measures, there were still major challenges ahead in ensuring that written changes in policies were carried out in practice. The Department of Justice, as recommended by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, reviewed the 2003 guidance regarding the use of race by federal law enforcement agencies and adopted in 2014 new guidance that also prohibits law enforcement biases based on ethnicity, gender, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. The new guidance eliminates the exception made in the former guidance regarding the use of racial profiling in cases of national security threats and enforcing laws protecting the integrity of the nation's borders. Although crime rates in the United States have been decreasing for the last 20 years, the federal and state and prison and local jail populations has soared to over 2.2 million, with another 7 million on parole or probation. African Americans are overrepresented in the penitentiary system, accounting for 36% of sentenced federal and state prisoners. African American women constitute 21% of the imprisoned female population. The incarceration rate for African American males is 5.9 times higher than the rate for white males, while the rate for African American females is 2.1 times higher than the rate for white females. The Sentencing Project has underscored that if current trends continue, 1 of every 3 Black American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime. Thousands of young African Americans, particularly those living under the poverty line and with low levels of educational attainment, have been placed in detention centers without addressing the root causes of crime, guaranteeing better security to the communities where they live, or offering them effective rehabilitation. The working group was informed that the war on drugs has had a devastating impact on African Americans, and that mass incarceration was considered a system of racial control that operated in a similar way as to how Jim Crow laws once operated. The working group observed that the federal authorities and some state authorities have recognized that mass incarceration has been ineffective and have started taking measures to curb some of its negative impacts. At the federal level, the administration has worked to enhance common sense sentencing reforms by reducing disparities in the mandatory minimums for crack and powder cocaine possession, the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, and by modernizing the federal sentencing guidelines for drug crimes. The majority of states have also lowered sentences for drug and property crimes and have increased opportunities for early release. The working group was also informed about the serious disadvantages that individuals with criminal records or a history of incarceration face when they go back to their communities. In accessing employment, housing, health, safe net programs, and welfare assistance. For example, African Americans with criminal records are 50% less likely to receive an interview request or job offer than individuals without criminal records. Furthermore, white men with a criminal record had more positive response in job applications than African American men with no criminal record, even when their work experience was the same. Individuals with records of low-level nonviolent offenses may be denied public housing assistance, and individuals with a felony drug record are fully or partially excluded from food stamps. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. In 30 states, this exclusion applies. Acknowledging this problem, the federal government has put in place some re-entry programs. The working group was informed that the Office of Personnel Management has modified its rules to delay inquiries into criminal history until later in the federal hiring process. Grantees of the Department of Labor Re-Entry Employment Opportunities Program are able to use grant funds to pay nonprofit legal services centers to assist program participants with mitigating the impacts of criminal records, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development intends to provide funds for organizations to assist with expediting, expunging, sealing, and or correcting juvenile or adult records. Nevertheless, the working group was informed that federal and state re-entry programs are underfunded in terms of meeting the number of prisoners who need the program, of which 600,000 prisoners were released each year. The working group is concerned about inadequate conditions of detention and about particularly serious barriers in accessing health treatment, including mental health treatment. A large number of prisoners in Pennsylvania who have been diagnosed with hepatitis C and are primarily of African descent have reportedly not received appropriate medication due to the high cost of treatment. The working group heard testimonies of labor in positions on inmates who earned about 15 to 20 cents per hour of work. African American communities emphasize that the privatization of detention centers might tend to privilege the earning of profits by sacrificing adequate detention conditions. The working group also heard how the mass incarceration of African American men and women had a devastating impact on their children. The working group commends the landmark Supreme Court decision that banned the application of the death penalty for children under 18 years of age, Roper versus Simmons, that prohibited life sentences without parole imposed on juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses, Graham versus Florida, and that considered unconstitutional mandatory life sentences without parole for children under 17 years of age convicted for homicide, Miller versus Alabama. Nevertheless, the working group is concerned that life imprisonment sentences can still be imposed on children convicted of homicide, that in 15 states children can still be tried as adults, and that around 10,000 children are housed in adult prisons and jails on any given day in the United States. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, 70% of the children sentenced to life in prison are African Americans. Solitary confinement or restrictive housing is an extensive practice in the United States. The Lyman program at Yale University estimates that approximately 80,000 to 100,000 inmates were being held in restrictive housing in federal and state penitentiaries in the fall of 2014. Based on the results of the National Inmate Survey 2011 through 2012, the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the Department of Justice estimated that 18% of the inmates in federal and state prison affirmed having been placed in solitary confinement during the course of 12 months. A study made by the New York City Department of the Health and Mental Hygiene on the records of first-time inmates in the New York City jail system between 2011 and 2013 found that African Americans were 2.52 times more likely than whites to be put in solitary confinement. The working group acknowledges that on January 25, 2016, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, announced the adoption of a set of recommendations made by the Department of Justice on the use of solitary confinement in the federal prison system. The Department of Justice recommended important measures such as ending of solitary confinement for juveniles and for inmates who have committed low-level infractions, the placement of inmates with serious mental illness in alternative forms of housing, limitations on the use of punitive segregation, the introduction of the principle of less restrictive conditions for inmates who face legitimate threats inside the prison, and the establishment of a data system to report on the use of solitary confinement. The working group was also informed about some reforms made at the state level, namely in Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, and Washington, aimed at restricting the use of solitary confinement. Notwithstanding these positive steps, the working group is concerned that the recommendations made by the Department of Justice are not binding and are only applicable to the federal prison system. The working group also informed that race was a significant factor in death penalty cases in the United States. African Americans represent 41.7% of death penalty cases in the United States. African Americans represent 41.7% of death row population and 34.6% of defendants executed since 1976 in the United States. Studies also reveal that there is a strong correlation between race and the decision to impose the death penalty. despite the fact that a vast majority, 90%, of homicides in the United States are intraracial. Out of 1,359 inmates executed in the United States in the period of time from 1976 reinstatement of capital punishment to 2013, only 17 were white defendants convicted of killing African Americans, while 230 African American defendants convicted for killing white persons were executed. The official composition of the jury is one of the main identified causes of racial bias in the application of the death penalty. While the Constitution of the United States of America entitles defendants to trial by an impartial jury, a common pattern in many states is that minorities are underrepresented on capital punishment juries. The working group acknowledges the recent ruling, Foster versus Chapman, in which the Supreme Court considered that prosecutors had violated Batson versus Kentucky, 1986, regarding race-based discrimination in jury selection. The dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion among the United States population. Hate crime groups, including white supremacist terror groups, are still active in the United States, targeting African Americans, as was seen in the attack at a church in Charleston in 2015. The Confederate flag is considered as a symbol of hate for many African Americans, and they have led campaigns to have it removed. However, it still is used by some local authorities. The working group was also concerned that voter ID laws with increased identification requirements and limits on early voting and registration in several states served to discriminate against minorities such as African Americans, contrary to the spirit of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 2013, the Supreme Court, in its decision in Shelby versus Holder, struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act, thereby making it easier to put in place voting restrictions at the state and local levels. All right, family. So we have taken a nice bite of the chunk of the UN General Assembly report, specifically highlighting the disparities and the discrimination and the institutional practices against the so-called African American population of the United States, including police brutality, incarceration, the debilitating conditions within the prison system, the disparities within the jury selection process, the so-called programs that are underfunded and not binding or implemented, the states and local municipalities' own reporting and tracking of various crimes against the African American population. So we have the information. The reports have been culminated. The information has been gathered. It has been reviewed. It has been examined. So as we look and we listen at the political frolicking of these campaign communists per se, we just look at their mouths move and we listen to the lies spew out as they practice the serpent tongue of sorcery against the people of the nation. And so, family, the American descendants of the enslaved, or to my brothers and sisters who are in the truth, the way, and the light, the Israelites, Lord willing, we shall continue with our review of the report and the various aspects of acknowledgement of the social, political, economic condition of the African American in the United States of America. And until we are together again, I love you. I love you. I love you. This is Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit.